Well, hello there and welcome. My name's Tim Bone and I'm a cognitive practitioner, and as well as that I'm also a mental health advocate. So what I've done this month is I've done a video on poverty where we'll be looking at poverty from a perspective that's different to the perspective that most viewers will have ever have seen poverty from before. I would describe this video as one of my awakening videos, as basically this video dispels the myth as well as an illusion that the vast majority of people have been convinced into believing by society, which results in anyone who becomes impoverished succumbing to a helplessness that can have a huge impact on their quality of health, and as well as that, a huge impact as well, that is a negative impact, on their life expectancy. This is a video that I would hope anybody who experiences poverty watching will come to learn that poverty is something that can be turned on its head. And instead of poverty being something that reduces a person's quality of health, and as well as that, their life expectancy, it can actually instead be used as something to enhance quality of health. And not only that, but also add years onto a person's life. In other words, I would hope that viewers after watching this video will see how poverty can be used to make a person look 20 years younger and live 20 years longer. Now, are you squinting while I'm saying this to you? Are you thinking, what on earth is he talking about? How could that possibly be? Well, if you are, do stay tuned and learn. Now, it was only last week I was watching a news broadcast. And it was a news broadcast that was about poverty in Venezuela, where the journalist was saying that just before President Maduro gained power back in 2013, this president had been saying that he was going to significantly reduce the amount of poverty in Venezuela, both in terms of the prevalence of poverty and as well as that the severity of poverty. Now, just like all politicians who are all mouth and no action, according to the journalist, poverty in Venezuela has never got any better. President Maduro was elected in 2013, and we are now in the year 2026. And therefore, over the last 13 years, the president of Venezuela has had no impact whatsoever in the reducing of the prevalence of poverty or the severity of poverty in Venezuela. The word typical just comes to mind when I watch that news broadcast. All these promises that politicians give us and never deliver upon. False promises and false hope and false expectations. That's a politician for you. You should watch my politicians video. Now, when I was watching this news broadcast, what I saw was men and women in Venezuela in torn clothes, going up to bins in the streets, looking for today's lunch or tonight's dinner. I was also seeing families in torn clothes going up to skips and looking through the rubbish in the skips, looking for furniture that they could pull out of it, that people had thrown out, and also looking for any clothes that people had thrown out as well. I also learned from this news broadcast that Venezuela has no welfare state either, which means therefore people have no access to things like statutory medical care, and as well as that, they also don't have access to any governmental financial support to help them meet the costs of living. In other words, they don't have a benefit system. After doing my own research into Venezuela, I learned that the average family living in poverty can only afford to live off $1.90 a day. As well as that, they've got no access to free, clean running water, and as well as that, no access to gas or electricity. They also suffer from severe malnourishment, and as well as that, like I just said, there is no welfare state, so they have no access to medications when they need them, They also have no access to governmental financial support in the meeting of the costs of living. Now, what I learned from watching these news broadcasts over the many years, and just doing my own background reading into poverty, is that poverty is very much a relative term. What is seen as being poverty in one country is different to what is seen as being poverty in another country. A country's picture or image of poverty is very much determined by the wealth of that country. And I would say that the term poverty exists on a continuum, where at one end of that continuum you have severe poverty, and at the other end of that continuum you have a poverty where you're just about meeting the needs of, where you're just about making ends meet in terms of meeting the costs of living, but only just with the help of governmental financial support, where all your other needs are met. And when I learned about this type of poverty that a person experiences in Venezuela, I thought to myself, this is an unsurvivable poverty. This is a poverty where it's impractical to survive it, both physically and mentally. This is a poverty which over time will have a detrimental effect on your health from the present moment right up to the end of life, where you can be sure that unless the poverty is addressed, the poverty will be cause of death, and you will not have a long life. You might be lucky to see another 10 years. There are many things that can kill a man or a woman living in poverty, and one of them is malnourishment. And malnourishment, again, is in itself a very relative term. But people who are living in severe poverty can find themselves living with nutritional deficiencies, such as vitamin D and calcium deficiencies, where they can be so low in vitamin D and calcium, as much as a knock would be enough to chip a kneecap, as much as a fall would be enough to fracture a pelvis, as much as a fall would be enough to fracture a skull and cause a head injury or even death. Broken bones could sever arteries and cause a person to bleed to death. Malnutrition can be messy, and I mean really messy. When a person doesn't get enough food, when they become malnourished, what can happen is the skin can thin. And what then happens is you get lots of open wounds develop in the skin, allowing for infection to get into the wounds. And these infections don't tend to be killed off by the body's immune system, simply because the body's immune system has been weakened as a result of the malnutrition. And therefore what happens is the infection survives and it spreads, and very often what can happen is it can spread into the bone. And where you get infection being spread into the bone, one of two things can happen. One thing a person can find happening is them needing an amputation of a body part. And another thing that they can find happening, if the infection has gone too deep into the bone, is that that person can find themselves experiencing a body toxicity that can bring on death. And therefore, with poverty, a person can find themselves experiencing a malnutrition that brings on things like the need for a leg amputation or a foot amputation or some other body part amputation. Or it can result in somebody being taken to the hospital with a sore body part, where they come to realise that that sore body part is infected as a result of an open wound. And it's now too late for this person because the infection has gone too deep into the bone to save this person, and this person dies. Like I say at the beginning of my videos, I'm a mental health advocate. And because I'm a mental health advocate, I've seen a lot of poverty. And I recently had a client who had been ignored by the social work department. And this was a client who had a learning disability and he had no cooking skills. He was impoverished and he also had no education, and he lived on his own. And what he was needing a social work assessment, where the social work would be able to identify his diet as being an area of concern where they could have put in carers that would have helped him go shopping to buy the right foods, and also put in carers to help him cook his foods so he could have a well-balanced diet. But unfortunately, the social work had been ignoring him, simply because if he was to receive that care, it would be government funded. And that would be because he couldn't afford to fund it himself, because he's impoverished. And unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, I'm afraid to say it, it is British culture to think that if somebody's not contributing to the economy, then they're not worth the investing in terms of buying them in care and buying in any support that will help them meet their needs. Social work just didn't see this man as being worth the investment, and as a result of that, they wouldn't spend the money on his care. And what happened as a result of this was this man's nutritional needs went unmet, and he developed an open wound in his foot. And an infection got into the open wound in his foot, and it wasn't killed off by the body's immune system because of his malnutrition. And as a result of this, the infection spread into the bone of his toe, and he ended up getting his toe amputated. Fortunately for him, he had got to hospital on time. If he had taken any longer at getting himself to hospital, he might have lost the foot instead. Or even worse, he could have died. Which can happen to people who are a bit stubborn and don't get themselves to hospital and can ignore the initial symptoms. This man's diet was terrible. Every time I meet this man, he's been telling me that all he's having for dinner tonight is a microwavable shepherd's pie or a microwavable lasagna. And whenever I ask him what he had for lunch, he just talks about having had a gammon sandwich. And he tells me that he's had the same food every day, every time I meet him, while we're waiting for this needs assessment to take place. And we've been battling with the social work department for quite a while to get this needs assessment done. And it is because of this social work negligence that he's ended up needing his toe amputated, where it could have been a foot, it could have been his life. And this is all because he doesn't have money. Now, poverty can expose people to other risk factors as well. It can have detrimental effects on people's health. And it is true that being an advocate, I've gone into people's homes, where these homes have been housing association homes. And in these housing association homes, what I have seen is I have seen dampness in walls, where the tenant has been forever bringing it up with the housing association, that they've got dampness in the wall and the wall needs fixing. And unfortunately, the housing association never get round to fixing the wall. And this dampness continues to remain to exist over the long term. And what happens is the damp wall starts to become infested by a fungal infection, where the fungus that starts to grow on this wall starts to release fungal spores, which when inhaled by the tenant can cause really bad fungal chest infections, which is bad news, and I mean very bad news, for anybody who's got an underlying respiratory condition like asthma or emphysema or chronic obstructive pulmonary airway disease. It's also double trouble if the person, as well as that, has an underlying heart condition as well. And therefore fungal chest infections can be deadly. And housing associations just ignore these people and just keep saying, yes, we'll get round to fixing it soon. Yes, we'll get round to fixing it soon, but they never do. And this happens to these people who live in these homes simply because they're impoverished. And therefore they're not in charge. And therefore they don't have the money to live in their own dwellings, where they can access the tradesman to repair the wall that they need repairing, or the money to live in a privately rented accommodation where the landlord is less immune from accountability if he doesn't get that wall fixed. And therefore this is another example of how poverty can have a huge impact on a person's quality of life, but also their quality of health and also their life expectancy. It's also true that people who live in poverty tend to live in areas where there's a lot of angry people. The truth is, people who live in poverty live in areas where there are other people living in poverty. And many people, quite understandably so, and quite rightly so, are angry and furious over the reasons why they've ended up living in poverty. You've got some people who are living in poverty after giving 30 years of their life to a private company, where they did nothing but worked hard for that company and showed a loyalty to that company over that 30-year period. And what happened was they went to work one day and that company said to them, look, empty your desk and get out, you're now redundant. And that was it. A 30-year loyal relationship just ended in seconds. And they find themselves redundant and are now not earning any money. And they're now finding it difficult to get another job because of their age or because they've got a limited skill set. And they've been unemployed now for the long term. And they're living in incredible poverty. And you can understand that they would be angry and they would feel let down and betrayed, which would make them feel angry, which would give them a rage. You've also got people who have ended up in poverty because they've been victims of social injustice. You might have somebody who's been a victim of discrimination and prejudice, which has stopped them from being able to, which caused them to lose their last job, and also stops them from being able to get a new job. And therefore, again, these people are experiencing what you would call social exclusion. And again, they're angry, and they're furious, and they're full of rage. You've also then got people as well who are living in poverty because they had a traumatic childhood. Their parents treated them badly. The school, the teachers, the authorities treated them badly. The school system was full of cracks that they went through. These are people who had many complex needs when they were children and adolescents, and there was no system in place to help them meet these needs, causing their education to just go through the cracks, and also their employability to go through the cracks as well. And they now live in poverty. And you can understand that they would be very angry people, very furious people. And there's a whole load of other examples that would be the reason behind why somebody finds themselves living in poverty. They would leave that person very angry and full of rage. And it is because people living in poverty who are angry live in areas where there are other people living in poverty who are angry, that there can be lots of fights, there can be lots of violence. And as a result of that in itself can have a damaging effect on one's health and also result in people being killed, dying off at young ages. As well as this, because people are angry, they can very often find themselves resorting to behaviours that can result in imprisonment. And also because many people are living in poverty and as a result of a lack of employability, many of them can also find themselves gravitating into crime. And therefore can get themselves killed or seriously injured while carrying out criminal activity or when in prison. And therefore you can see how the anger and rage associated with living in poverty can result in damaged quality of health, and as well as that, a reduced life expectancy. It is true that many people in the United Kingdom, when they become impoverished, turn to alcohol, overconsumption. They might overindulge in pre-existing bad habits of theirs, such as becoming an excessive smoker. Might end up taking other intoxicating compounds that can have a huge damaging effect on body and mind. The reason why they do this is simply to substitute the joy that they do not get, that other people get to enjoy, simply because living in poverty brings nothing other than mental and physical suffering every day of their lives. Therefore, you could argue that they turn to unhealthy joy to substitute healthy joy that their life living in poverty does not provide them with. This has a huge detrimental effect on quality of health and life expectancy. What I've just mentioned here are just a few examples of how poverty can have a huge negative impact on quality of health and life expectancy. And there are many, many more examples, which if I was to go into, this video would be too long. Now, it must be said, one thing that society is guilty of as a result of its news broadcasts, its soap operas, the stories that it has told other people about other people's experiences of living in poverty, is creating this image that poverty is a negative downward spiral towards increased helplessness and hopelessness and suffering, where things get worse, or if they don't get worse, they won't get better anyway, and you'll just become, and as a result of that, you'll eventually become burned out. As a result of this, people who become impoverished identify with being somebody who is living on this negative downward spiral. And this brings on a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness in them that gives them low expectations of themselves in terms of what the future looks like for them and in terms of what their future prosperity looks like. And this therefore results in them succumbing to a helplessness that causes them to make unconscious decisions, as well as unconsciously choose lifestyle choices that they associate with people living on this downward spiral, so compromising future prosperity, health, and life expectancy. These people who end up impoverished can remember the modern study lessons that they attended in the first and second year of secondary school. They can also remember all the public health information that they had read on poverty, and also the media's portrayal of what it's like to live in poverty. And as a result of this, they've grown up associating poverty with behaviours and lifestyle choices such as alcohol addiction, drug addiction, poor diet, / malnutrition, increased likelihood, and quite a significantly increased likelihood of gravitating into crime and ending up in prison. The overindulging in pre-existing bad habits, such as excessive smoking, engaging in other self-sabotaging behaviours, such as gambling, being looked down upon by others and treated like a third-class citizen, because they unfortunately believe themselves to be a third-class citizen, coming from a home culture where there's a high prevalence of domestic violence, and a whole load of other associations that you can think of, that people throughout their upbringing have learned to associate being impoverished with being or becoming or engaging in, etc. And this therefore results in them succumbing to a helplessness that causes them to make unconscious decisions, as well as unconsciously choose lifestyle choices that they associate with people living who are impoverished. And this results in the damaging of the health of those, and also in the reduced life expectancy of those living in poverty. Now, a good example of this is where I'm from. And there's an area in Glasgow called Maryhill. Now, this area of Glasgow is an area of Glasgow where many people live in extreme poverty. And the life expectancy of those living in this part of Glasgow is 54. That's right, 54. And then there's another area of Glasgow called Milngavie. And in Milngavie, the life expectancy there is 84. Therefore, there is a 30-year difference between the life expectancy of somebody from a very impoverished Mary Hill and a very wealthy Mogai. Now, this difference in life expectancy is obviously because of poverty. However, poverty need not have this effect on life expectancy. Very often it has this effect on life expectancy because of what we have been societally conditioned into believing and behaving like, and thinking like, when we become impoverished. Now, with a positive mindset, poverty can be turned on its head, and it can actually be used to increase quality of health as well as life expectancy. Now, some of you are probably watching, oh aye, as if that's the case. Oh, come on, be real. How can you possibly have good quality of health as well as high life expectancy with very limited resources to meet the costs of living? Well, it's that kind of thinking, I'm afraid to say it, that succumbs you to the helplessness that a person who becomes impoverished succumbs to. And it's also that kind of thinking that leads you to a life sentence of living in poverty with no parole. Now, poverty can be seen as being a destroyer. There's no doubt about it. Poverty damages health, and poverty has taken lives, and poverty has also damaged prosperity and stopped people from bringing to fruition their potential and doing with their lives what they're capable of doing with their lives. And therefore it can be seen as a destroyer. And yes, when somebody becomes impoverished, they could think to themselves, oh my God, life has become so desperate. It's become so desperate because of my poverty, because of the poverty I live in. How much I would love this life to be brought to an end right now. I cannot cope anymore. Please, something strike me with lightning and allow me to escape this misery called living life on planet Earth. Now, that's the thinking of somebody who sees the desperation of living in poverty as being a destroyer. However, you can also see the desperation of living in poverty as being a motivator. Somebody who sees the desperation of poverty being a motivator thinks something along the lines of, oh my God, life is so desperate as a result of this poverty that I find myself having to live with. Right, that's it. I deserve a better life than this, and I'm going to give myself a better life than this. I'm going to do everything I can with the knowledge and the skills that I have to remove myself from poverty and give myself a much better life. And I'm going to make this my life goal, making my life better. While everyone else is being asked what they do for a living and giving as an answer their occupations, when people ask me what I do for a living, I'm going to be saying to them, making life better and removing myself from poverty. And with this mindset, a person can very often remove themselves from poverty. Let me tell you this, an optimist who sees the desperation of poverty as being a motivator for making life better will make as his goal in life the making of life better and the escaping from the desperation of poverty. And a life that is full of goals is a life that gives a person a passion for living. And a passion for living can in itself add years onto a person's life. Somebody with the right mindset, for example, might think to themselves, right, that's it. I'm going to make life better for myself. I'm going to find a job or a better job where I'm going to remove myself from the desperation of poverty and make life more fulfilling, rewarding, and incomparably more financially comfortable. An example of somebody thinking like this might be somebody who thinks to themselves, right, I'm out of a job. I've been out of a job a long time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to a pub every night over the next year. And it's going to be a different pub every night. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, never allow myself to go over my weekly allowance of alcohol. That will never be allowed. In fact, what I'm going to do is every night I go down to the pub, I'm going to buy myself 1 pint of lager, and I'm going to make that pint last. And what I'm going to do during that 1 pint of lager is I'm going to make sure I get speaking to somebody up at the bar who's also there on their own. Or I might even be even bolder and maybe speak to somebody who's there with a friend. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to them, and I'm going to have a conversation with them, and I'm going to start a conversation with them where during that conversation I'm going to get it out that I'm somebody who's without a job and I'm currently looking for a job. And over a period of a year, what will happen is I'll get speaking to at least 365 people up at a bar. And I might even get speaking to more than that. Because one thing I will do is I will find out quickly in that conversation what that person does for a living. And if it comes out that they're not self-employed, then what I'll do is I'll bring that conversation to a close. And then I'll go and try and make a conversation with somebody else. And therefore I'll likely get talking to more than 365 people for a period of a year. And as I'm speaking to these people and making them aware that I'm out of a job and looking for a job, think of how many of these 365 plus people will be self-employed and probably own a business and currently have a vacancy at their company where they're looking to employ someone. This could result in me being given a job. I could be offered a job that evening during that conversation with that person who's self-employed, who I've got talking to. For all I know, I might come out of a pub tomorrow night with a card with a phone number and a name on it, being told to phone them back to discuss at a later date the coming down to start my first day. People find jobs this way. It's called networking. This person will probably think to themselves, and what I'll do when I come to the end of my pint of lager while talking to this person is I will tell the barman that I wish a pint of water and that I'll be drinking water for the rest of the night because I've got heartburn. And I'll make sure that the man that I'm speaking to, or the woman that I'm speaking to, hears that I've got heartburn. And therefore for the rest of the evening I can talk to them just drinking pints of water. I can just say to them, if you don't mind, I won't drink any more alcohol for the rest of the night. I'll just drink water because I've got a bit of heartburn. And that's how you keep yourself beneath your weekly alcohol allowance, going out every night to a bar with the intention of talking to some people. Do remember that in the United Kingdom, 13 to 14% of the population are self-employed. Therefore, 1 in 7 people that you get talking to in a bar are self-employed and might have a vacancy. And therefore, this is the thinking of somebody who thinks, right, poverty is desperate, and I hate the desperation of poverty, so I'm going to remove myself from poverty by making life better for myself. And one thing I'm going to do is go down to the bar every night and engage in this activity with the purpose of finding a job. You can see, therefore, how somebody with the negative, what opportunities somebody with a negative mindset towards living in poverty is denying themselves, can't you? Now, when you become impoverished, or if you're already living in poverty, one of the things that you have to become good at is becoming observant enough to notice what cheap things you can afford and what expensive things you can't afford. Now, there is this unfortunate association that we have been societally conditioned into believing, where we believe and associate everything that is cheap with being of low quality. And we also believe and associate anything that is expensive as being high quality. Now, this is very true for something like a leather jacket. If I go out and buy a cheap leather jacket, I don't expect it to last me probably any more than a year before it starts to look really battered. However, if I buy an expensive leather jacket, I can probably get about 6 or 7 years wear out of that jacket before it's starting to look worn. And so that association is true with some things, but it's not true with others. And one thing it's not true with is food. Now, the expense of food in Western culture, in Western society, is not determined by how nutritious that food is. The expense of a food is more determined by how gratifying the Western palate of a civilian finds a particular food. Where the more gratifying a Western's palate finds a food, the more expensive that food. And this is why things like takeaway pizzas, curries, kebabs, Chinese meals, any other kind of meals that you can think of that could be described as being takeaway food, are all expensive. And not only are these foods expensive, but they're also high in salt, saturated fat, sugar and calories, making them incredibly unhealthy foods, making them foods that make you prone to developing stroke, heart disease, diabetes, etc. If you eat these foods frequently, which many people who can afford these foods tend to do. Now, if you look at healthy foods are usually very cheap foods, very cheap. Look at a bag of whole wheat pasta, for example. A 500 gram bag of whole wheat pasta only costs 75 pence. That's all it costs. And they say that a 500 gram bag of whole wheat pasta has 6 servings in it. If you have a big appetite, it's probably more like 2 servings. However, that's 2 meals that whole wheat pasta will do you if you've got a huge appetite that costs you only 75 pence to buy. Now, whole wheat pasta is a powerhouse food in terms of how good it is for you. Whole wheat pasta is full of vitamin B. And vitamin B brings on a process called neurogenesis, which is where the brain produces more grey matter. And therefore, foods like whole wheat pasta can protect you from conditions like dementia. Not only that, but whole wheat pasta is also full of nutrients called antioxidants. And antioxidants prevent mutagenic changes from taking place in your DNA, which can bring on cancer. Antioxidants also protect the end of your chromosomes called telomeres, thus preventing premature aging, thus preventing accelerated aging. And it is true as well that whole wheat pasta is full of fibre, which prevents cancer, such as bowel cancer, which is a cancer that we're seeing increase in prevalence in the under 50s significantly because of the foods that I just spoke about as being expensive foods. The number of people below the age of 50 now who are living off processed meals. And therefore it can be said that whole wheat pasta is a very healthy food. In fact, the term very healthy is an understatement. It's more than very healthy. It's like I said, it's a powerhouse of a food in terms of how healthy it is for you and how good it is in terms of how good it is for both quality of health as well as life expectancy. Another example of a very affordable food that's very healthy for you is something like tinned vegetables. Look at tinned tomatoes. Tinned tomatoes are full of vitamin A, C and E. And full of antioxidants as well. And a tin of tomatoes, being full of antioxidants, like I said, with whole wheat, prevents mutagenic changes from happening in your DNA, thus preventing the onset of conditions like cancer. And as well as that, they protect the end of your chromosomes, which are called telomeres, thus preventing accelerated aging. The vitamin C also makes your body produce collagen, which gives you nice plump skin, which makes you look young. And also the vitamin A and E gives you a nice flush look, which makes you look young and healthy. Therefore, tinned vegetables like tomatoes are incredibly good for your health. They again are powerhouse foods in terms of the number of nutrients they've got in them and what these nutrients do for health and longevity. And a tin of tomatoes is only about maybe 50 pence, no more than that. And if we look at another cheap food, as another example, let's look at tin fish like salmon. You can actually make 6 salmon rolls, which will stuff you, okay, for a price of no more than £4.50. And salmon is full of omega-3s, which are good for your heart health as they reduce cholesterol levels. It's also full of vitamin B, which again is good for brain health. It's full of a compound called choline, which is good for brain health as well. And it's full of vitamin D and calcium, which is great for bone health. And therefore, again, salmon is a food which, again, is very healthy and very cheap. Now, what I've done there is I've just gone over 3 examples of foods that are healthy and are cheap. And there are many more foods that are healthy and cheap. Numerous numbers of foods that are both healthy and cheap. And therefore it is true to say that a healthy diet can be a very cheap diet. A plant-based diet, or a diet that is mostly plant-based, is an incredibly cheap diet, an incredibly nutritious diet, and incredibly good for health and longevity. And therefore there is an argument for saying that if you're impoverished, you will not have the money to spend on the junk food, on the takeaways, on the unhealthy foods. And you will have to resort to eating cheap meals, which are made up of healthy foods. And therefore there is an argument for saying that if you become impoverished, your diet will improve. And therefore there's an argument for saying that if you become impoverished, you can expect a diet that will promote health and that will promote good health, as well as increased life expectancy. And therefore this is a good example of how poverty can be turned on its head to increase both quality of health and life expectancy. Now that we've looked at diet, let's have a look at a compound that society too often encourages us to consume. The price of a pint of lager where I'm from is about £5.50. Alcohol is an incredibly expensive compound. Incredibly. And I've been on a very low income before. I've lived on the benefit system before. And when I lived on the benefit system, I still went down to the pub because I'm somebody who lives on the west coast of Scotland. And I'm afraid to say it, all of my friends from school and university emigrated. They all emigrated beyond Scotland's shores. And as a result of that, I was the only one left living on the west coast of Scotland. And therefore, what I do to socialise is I go down to a pub and I just get speaking to people at the bar. And that's what I do. And that's a good way in socialising, because you're always thinking, I wonder who I'll get speaking to tonight. I wonder if there'll be an interesting person and what kind of a background they're from. And what I was doing when I was living on the benefit system was I was going down to the bar, I was going into pubs to speak to people, where I would say to the barman when I arrived there, listen, I'm on a low income, okay? So what I'm going to be doing, I only want to drink 3 pints tonight. I don't want to drink any more than that. But I'd like to stay out for maybe 5 hours tonight. I want to stay out for a long time. So I don't want to spend my budget on alcohol too quickly. So what I'm going to be doing is every pint I ask for, every second pint I drink tonight will be a pint of water. And that's what I say to the bar. That's what I said to the barman. I would say to him, my first pint will be a pint of lager, my next pint will be a pint of water, and then my next pint will be a pint of lager, and then my next pint will be a pint of water, and so on. And that's what I said to him. And I told him that this was because I was impoverished and I didn't have the money to spend on alcohol, and I wanted to stay out late. And he was okay with that, and he was absolutely fine by that. Now you might say, why in hell's teeth did you feel the need to tell him that? Well, I told him that because I don't know what it's like where you're from, but where I'm from, if there's anything unusual about a customer, if there's anything that makes a customer stand out in a bar, that's enough to have the doorman tell you to leave. It's especially true if you're drinking water, because that's when the bar staff start to worry that you're maybe a part of some sort of operation that's going on in their bar, where there are maybe other guys as well drinking water, and you and them are part of some sort of dodgy operation that they don't want going on in their bar, and that in itself therefore is a reason to ask you to leave. They might also think that you're somebody who's deliberately staying sober, so you can sexually come on to the drunk members of the opposite sex, and take advantage of members of the opposite sex, which is not what you're doing. You're saving money. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is by drinking in this way, which I was forced to do because I was on a low income, I saved a huge amount of money. And therefore it could be said that when you're impoverished, you will be encouraged because of costs to either reduce your alcohol intake significantly or even eliminate it from your life completely. Where both of these measures are good for health, both in terms of quality of health and life expectancy. Both of these measures are good for brain, good for liver, and good for kidneys. And therefore, this again is an example of how poverty can be turned on its head to increase both quality of health and life expectancy. If you are impoverished and you have the right mindset, you will look for opportunities to save money wherever you possibly can. And one of the things you will choose to do if you're a driver and you're living in terrible poverty is you will choose to keep your car parked outside your home and never take it anywhere with you. When you look at the cost of running a car is expensive. You've got car insurance, you've got road tax insurance, you've got road tax to pay, you've got fuel costs to meet, and as well as that you've got 2 MOT servicings and tests to pay for every year. And therefore the costs of running a car are extortionate. And therefore if you are living in poverty, you will either choose to start taking public transport, which is much cheaper, or you might even choose to start walking. When I lived in poverty, what I chose to do was I chose to no longer drive a car. And what I did instead was I started walking every journey that was less than 2 miles in duration. And that got me incredibly fit. Therefore, you can argue that poverty can encourage you to live a more physically active life, which again is going to be good for brain and heart and all-round body health. And therefore, again, this is an example of turning poverty on its head so that it increases quality of health as well as life expectancy. It is also true that when you live in poverty, this can erode your confidence, your morale, and your self-esteem considerably. Now, virtually everybody, I would imagine, has heard of the relationship between exercise and mental fitness, and will have heard the term, if you're physically fit, you're mentally fit. Well, let me tell you, this term is very, very true. And if you have heard of this term, and you appreciate this term, one thing you might choose to do, if you've got the right mindset towards poverty, is you might choose to restore your confidence, your morale and your self-esteem by turning to exercise. Exercise is a very cheap pastime, and it costs nothing to say to your partner, right, that's me. I'm just going off for a 3-4 mile jog tonight, darling. And I'll be back probably in about half an hour. It also costs nothing to join a gym that gives you 24-hour access to treadmills and cross trainers. My gym only costs £17 a month, therefore it's a very cheap pastime, keeping fit. And many people will choose to keep fit to rehabilitate, to restore their morale, their self-esteem and their confidence, which again is going to be good for all-round body health, especially brain health and cardiovascular health. which will again increase quality of health and also your life expectancy. It's also true as well, like I just said, that it's a very cheap pastime. And when you're living in poverty, you will probably look towards taking up pastimes that are cheaper than the pastimes you used to engage in. And exercise is a good example of such a pastime that you can engage in for hours per week. That's very enjoyable and very addictive and costs minimal money. And like I said, will enhance both quality of health and life expectancy. Now, when you're living in poverty, we already touched on this at the beginning. And what you can find when you're living in poverty is you can find yourself living with a huge amount of anger, rage, frustration, stress, anxiety, agitation. And as a result of this, living with these emotions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week can become unbearable. And yes, these emotions can have a wear and tear effect on your brain, and they can also have a wear and tear effect on your heart, making you vulnerable to conditions like dementia, stroke, heart disease, and a whole load of other conditions that excess stress can expose you to the risk of. Now, as a result of this increased emotional stress load that you have to live with, you have an incentive for taking up a mental health symptom management technique such as meditation. And it is true, by doing 2 half-hour sessions a day, morning and night that is, of meditation, you can eliminate all of these negative emotions from your life, which is greatly enhancing for heart health and brain health. You can actually find yourself experiencing these negative emotions less. Somebody who's not living in poverty experiences these negative emotions. You can become very chilled out. Poverty. And therefore, as a result of this, meditation again can increase quality of life and also life expectancy. Meditation brings on a process called neurogenesis, which is a process where the brain produces more grey matter, thus preventing you from developing conditions like dementia. And as well as that, meditation also makes the blood-brain barrier produce a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that the brain produces that brings on feelings of reward, motivation, and confidence. And therefore, meditation can make you a much more confident person who feels much more optimistic about the future, giving you the healthy mindset that you need to be able to remove yourself from poverty. So does exercise, by the way. I forgot to mention this when we were talking about exercise. Exercise also makes the blood-brain barrier produce dopamine as well. And you see, when you meditate and exercise, your blood-brain barrier can produce huge dopamine levels that can last for days in duration, making it a very good mental health symptom self-management technique for depression, as well as all the negative emotions that I just described poverty as being able to bring on in you. Poverty also means that you will no longer have the money to engage any of the unhealthy social activities and leisure activities that you used to be able to engage in with friends that were very compromising to health. Gone will be the day of being able to afford 2-week summer holiday with friends in Magaluf, Tenerife, Corfu, or any of the other Mickey Mouse destinations that exist in the Mediterranean, where people go to, where they spend 2 weeks of over-consuming alcohol and food. It's just 2 weeks of gluttony. These 2-week holidays, these 2-week breaks of gluttony, are things that you will no longer be able to afford to do, and will therefore no longer do. You'll also no longer be able to afford Christmas, which means you'll become somebody that the corporate world can no longer take advantage of, but also you'll become somebody who doesn't overindulge in food and drink towards the end of December and beginning of January of every year. You'll also become somebody who can't afford going out for every birthday of every friend that he or she has, as a result of the price of over-consuming food and alcohol. And as well as this, you'll also have to drop out of the pub crawl culture by bringing an end to these late night pub crawls, simply because of their expense and your lack of money. It is all enhancing for quality of health as well as life expectancy. What you'll also find yourself having to do is having to find social activities, leisurable activities, that cost next to no money or are very cheap to engage in. And examples of such activities would be things like games. You might find yourself, when you become impoverished, thinking to yourself, right, that's it. I'm not going out for late nights anymore. I'm not going drinking anymore. I can't afford things like the cinema anymore. I can't afford going to the theatre. Can't afford going to concerts. So what I'm going to do instead now is I'm going to go to my local pub where they have a chess club, and I'm going to go to that chess club and play chess. Or I'm going to bring some friends round, and what we're going to do is we're going to play a game of cards. Play some other kind of game that requires us to use our cognition. In other words, our initiative, our intuition, and our insight. And like I say, these games can go a long way in preventing dementia, because you're using your cognition in the playing of these games. And as well as that, playing these games keeps you away from toxic compounds, thus preventing you from damaging your health, and thus looking after your health and increasing your life expectancy. And these games are also good at distracting you from things that are compromising to your health as well. If you're a smoker, having a game of cards or having a game of chess will certainly reduce the number of cigarettes you have over the duration of the game to either zero or a number of cigarettes that's far less than the number of cigarettes you would usually smoke over the same period of time, engaging in one of the other unhealthy activities that you used to engage in when you could afford these activities. Now, what I've done in this video is I've gone over with you just a few examples of how poverty puts a person in a position where the poverty encourages them to give up one thing and take up another thing, where the giving up of something is enhancing to both quality of health and life expectancy, and the taking up of something is again enhancing for quality of health and life expectancy. And therefore, what all of these examples do is they evidence to you how there's just as much an argument, if you have the right mindset that is, for saying poverty can increase quality of health and life expectancy, as there is an argument for saying poverty decreases these things. I've just mentioned 5 or 6 examples there of things that a person that living in poverty should encourage a person to give up and take up, that will have a protective effect on quality of health and life expectancy. Maybe you can think up other examples if you choose to get into a conversation over this subject with someone you've just met or with a friend. I will finish off by saying that in this video we have looked at how poverty can increase the life expectancy and quality of health of the person living in a poverty that can be described as being a poverty where you have a home with a kitchen, a bathroom, a lounge and a bedroom, where they have access to clean running water, as well as gas and electricity, and free statutory medical care, where with the money that they have coming in from either a job that they're in, some other private source, combined with the governmental financial support, is enough money for them to meet their essential needs of living, just and no more. But if they didn't have that governmental financial support, expenditure would always be greater than their income. thus causing them to go through the cracks of society. That's the level of poverty that we've been talking about in this video. In this video, the point that has been made and justified through the use of examples is that a person living in such a poverty with the right mindset need not have their quality of health or life expectancy compromised by living in poverty, and instead should see their poverty as being a period in their life where they can turn down the health compromising things and take up the health promoting things, thus enhancing quality of health and life expectancy, thus discrediting the argument that it is always the case that if poverty has an impact on quality of health and life expectancy, it will always be a compromising one. It is very much dependent on the mindset, how observant a person you are. This is how poverty can result in someone looking 20 years younger and living 20 years longer. So if that claim that I made at the beginning of this video had you squinting, I hope this video has removed that squint. And I also hope that anybody living in poverty will have a more positive mindset towards poverty and see how poverty can be turned on its head, where it can be turned from being a negative into a massive positive in terms of quality of health and life expectancy. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot from this video and became aware of this video, and became aware of a lot from watching this video. And you've got a more open-minded outlook on what it means to be impoverished from a health perspective and life expectancy perspective. In the meantime, take care and see you next month. Goodbye.